Over the next 45 minutes, we'll be looking to the future of modern slavery, human trafficking, and forced labour eradication efforts, hearing from two experts who will outline some of the unique challenges COVID-19 poses, potential ways of mitigating these problems, and explore the crucial role survivors and survivor-led initiatives play in informing policy development. This session is split into three parts. First, we'll hear from Tatiana Kotlarenko, who is an advisor on anti-trafficking issues for the Organization for Security and Cooperation, and who is with us today to share their organization's report into human trafficking under COVID. We'll then be turning to Jerome Alam, who is a survivor advocate and the president and CEO of the Trafficking in America Task Force, who will share his thoughts and experiences on incorporating survivor voices into decision-making processes. Finally, at the end, there will be an opportunity for the audience to ask the panelists questions in a dedicated Q&A session. Thank you both for being here. Tatiana, if I could turn to you first, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Once again, my name is Tatiana Kotlarenko. I'm the advisor on anti-trafficking issues at the Organization for Security Cooperation in Europe's Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights. Dear Excellencies, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to speak here today on this important topic. The COVID-19 pandemic created new risks and challenges to victims and survivors of trafficking and exacerbated the vulnerabilities of at-risk groups to trafficking. To analyze emerging trafficking in human beings trends and dynamics, and to develop recommendations based on empirical data to address the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, OSCE, ODIHR, and UN Women conducted a global survey of survivors of trafficking and frontline stakeholders. Based on the survey findings and empirical data collected, a set of policy recommendations were developed, which resulted in the ODIHR and UN Women policy recommendations on addressing emerging human trafficking trends and consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic, which should be shortly launched in English, Russian, Spanish, and French. And actually, it has already been launched in English. We would like to extend special thanks to all survivors and organizations around the globe that answered the survey, as well as to Dr. Maya Rusakova for drafting and analyzing the report. If we could have the slides, that would be great as well. Thank you. The empirical data was collected from two surveys, one from survivors of trafficking, with a response rate from over 40 countries, and two from frontline stakeholders with a response rate from 103 countries. We'd like to recognize the panel of experts consisting of representatives of states, international organizations, and the survivor leader who were contributing to the development of the policy recommendations, and whom we are honored to have had the contribution from. The survey of survivors of trafficking demonstrated the following. The highest percentage of survivors respondents represented the United States of America, Canada, and South Africa. Respondents were able to select from 25 languages. Safety and ethic protocols were put in place for informed consent and the security of survivors. With regards to the survey of frontline stakeholders, for this particular survey, respondents were predominantly female. This disproportion is particularly evident for the OSCE region at 87.4%. And for those who do not know the constitution of the OSCE region, it is 57 countries, all of North America, all of Europe, South Caucasus, Central Asia, and Mongolia. Participants were able to select among 18 languages to respond to this particular survey. One of the key findings is that compared to the situation before the COVID-19 pandemic, the survivors had difficulties in accessing almost all services. Survivors of trafficking reported lack of access to basic needs, including access to food and water, safe and comfortable accommodation, and lack of access to testing for COVID-19, although access to information and employment, psychological, medical, and social services was prioritized by respondents. In particular, survivors from non-OSCE countries more frequently reported that their access to food and water had become much more difficult. Furthermore, the survey also revealed that the differences in COVID-19 related changes in access to services were not drastically different between male and female survivors of trafficking. According to the survivors survey, The areas of life most negatively affected by the pandemic were psychological and financial well-being, around 70% of the respondents. Survivors reported a decline in financial well-being due to the lack of job opportunities and unemployment and the overall economic downturn. Psychological well-being likewise declined due to a high level of uncertainty, isolation due to restriction of movement, and retriggering of post-traumatic stress disorder. Some of the respondents stated positive changes as a result of the lockdown, but overall respondents reported a worsening of their mental health condition. Overall, both male and female respondents believe that the COVID-19 pandemic has had a more significant negative impact on women survivors than that of men. Overall, survivors were poorly informed about changes in service provision during the pandemic. About half of the survivors experienced delays in receiving statutory status of victim of trafficking or in other types of legal procedures. These delays negatively affected the survivors' ability to access shelter accommodation, reunification with their children, and financial compensation. More than half of the survivors believe that the COVID-19 pandemic has had exacerbated the vulnerability of at-risk groups to trafficking in human beings. They noted that the economic downturn will increase the vulnerability to recruitment by traffickers and the risk of re-victimization of survivors. They added that these factors are further negatively impacted by reprioritization of human and financial resources by government institutions to fight the COVID-19 pandemic. From the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, every third survivor respondent was targeted with at least one or several offers which were directly or potentially related to possible exploitation. The most common offers were employment in the same country, including offers from the sex industry, and employment without provision of information on the type of job or skills required for it. In most cases, these offers were made online, suggesting that online forms of recruitment by traffickers continued during the pandemic. Victims of trafficking who are currently in situations of exploitation may also be facing new or more severe forms of exploitation due to the financial downturn, which has affected the traffickers' ability to generate profits. Moreover, victims of trafficking are also at higher risk of contracting COVID-19 due to their trafficking situation. The survey of frontline stakeholders clearly showed that the government's capacity to combat trafficking in human beings has been negatively impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. This impact is particularly evident in the following areas: identification procedures, sheltered accommodation, and social services. Furthermore, the proper functioning of national referral mechanisms or equivalent systems has also been affected. Approximately half of the countries currently have a partially operational NRM or equivalent system. One general finding is that countries with national referral mechanisms have been better able to address the vulnerability to trafficking of at-risk populations and to re-trafficking of survivors of trafficking, compared with countries without national referral mechanisms or equivalent systems. Since most OSCE participating states, the 57 I've mentioned, have operational national referral mechanisms or equivalent systems, accessibility of services has been affected during the COVID-19 pandemic, but not as much as in other regions of the world. According to frontline stakeholders, it has become more difficult for victims and survivors of trafficking to access rehabilitation services, administrative procedures, and protection, as stated by an overwhelming majority of the respondents. Yet, respondents working in OSCE countries reported higher accessibility to services for victims of trafficking in their countries compared with other countries in total. While traffickers have been able to quickly adapt their activities to the online sphere during the COVID-19 pandemic, government agencies and civil society have had difficulty doing so. Approximately 9 out of 10 respondent organizations are able to provide access to services to their beneficiaries, but mostly by phone. Survivors noted that access to online tools or simply access to Wi-Fi can be costly and inaccessible to them. Emerging trafficking trends and consequences due to the COVID-19 pandemic are marked by gender-specific vulnerabilities and are further exacerbated by already existing gender inequalities. Prior to the pandemic, women and girls constituted the majority of detected victims of trafficking, and it is likely that this trend will continue during and in the aftermath of the pandemic, especially impacting marginalized communities. Respondents reported an increased vulnerability of women and girls to trafficking for the purpose of sexual exploitation, especially women in physical locations and girls online. At the same time, there was an increase in trafficking of men and boys for the purpose of exploitation and criminal activities, and particularly men for labor exploitation and boys for forced begging. The COVID-19 pandemic has also exacerbated the vulnerabilities of children to trafficking, which requires the preparedness of all stakeholders to provide additional services for trafficked children as a result during and post-pandemic. For instance, online sexual exploitation of children is increasing. In addition, the implementation of emergency measures has resulted in the halting of identification procedures of children. Moreover, the COVID-19 pandemic has significantly impacted the operation of shelters for victims of trafficking. Almost half of the respondents stated that their shelters lacked sufficient space, could not accommodate new beneficiaries, or had to close. This may pose additional risks of secondary victimization as it leads to decreased accessibility of safe accommodation. Beneficiaries of anti-trafficking organizations may have additional needs, and organizations require additional funding to manage the pandemic's mid to long-term consequences for combating trafficking in human beings. More than 3/4 of respondents stated that their organizations currently require additional funding to address needs resulting from the COVID-19 pandemic. Moreover, an overwhelming majority reported the need for additional funding in the next 12 months to address long-term consequences. According to the respondents, if organizations do not receive the required funding in 2020-2021, only about a quarter of them will remain fully operational, more than half will remain partly operational, and 1.6% will close. A lack of necessary funding could therefore result in a loss of a large number of anti-trafficking NGOs, experienced staff, and the long-term ability to ensure effective functioning of NREMs and equivalent systems. In addition, the survey of frontline stakeholders revealed that there's an urgent need to strengthen anti-trafficking frameworks during and after the COVID-19 pandemic. For instance, respondents pointed to the need for governments to undertake measures to address demand for trafficking in human beings in the areas of legislation, prevention, and strengthening of anti-trafficking frameworks. More efforts are needed to mitigate the consequences of the pandemic on at-risk groups vulnerable to trafficking, including migrants, women in the sex industry, and unaccompanied minors, and those whose vulnerability has been exacerbated due to the subsequent economic downturn. Overall, the majority of the respondents expressed a strong interest in the development of a national protocol on prevention of trafficking in human beings and protection of the human rights of victims and survivors of trafficking during states of emergencies, including pandemics. Based on these survey findings and research, OSCE, ODIHR, and UN Women have developed policy recommendations to address the consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic on combating trafficking in human beings, covering 11 areas. For instance, states need to strengthen the implementation of international and national legal frameworks. A national legal framework is fundamental to effectively address the intermediate and long-term trafficking in human being impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. States which have not ratified, signed, and acceded to the Palermo Protocol and incorporated its provisions into national anti-trafficking legislation should do so as a priority. Transnational referral mechanisms and robust anti-trafficking domestic legislation are essential for criminalization and prosecution of the human trafficking crime, ensuring assistance and support to victims, prevention efforts, and fostering cooperation. In addition, it is important to develop and/or effectively implement national referral mechanisms to address human trafficking trends and consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic. National referral mechanisms are essential to the functioning of anti-trafficking frameworks nationally, especially during states of emergency. National referral mechanisms should be grounded in human rights, non-discriminatory, gender-sensitive, trauma-informed, and victim and survivor-centered approach, and implemented in all states to include at minimum the following: an independent national rapporteur and a national coordinator. interagency councils, multidisciplinary cooperation across between government institutions and civil society, and survivor advisory councils. National referral mechanisms should also include special national referral mechanisms for children. Moreover, states should develop or update their national strategies and national action plans to combat trafficking in human beings to address the emerging COVID-19 trends and dynamics. States also need to strengthen the proactive identification of victims of trafficking, especially women and children, during the COVID-19 pandemic and after, by adopting responses to changes in operational capacity to address human trafficking emerging trends, especially in cyberspace. The accessibility of services to victims and survivors of trafficking during and post-COVID-19 pandemic needs to be ensured by declaring these services are essential. In order to guarantee the access to remedies, states should ensure equal access to fair, timely, and effective justice for victims of trafficking and survivors of trafficking. This should include facilitating and prioritizing online functioning of justice services wherever possible during emergency situations, including pandemics. It is of utmost importance that states address the gender-specific dynamics of trafficking in human beings, its consequences, harms, and recovery processes, as approximately 3/4 of all detected trafficking victims currently are women and girls. All aspects of the NRM should therefore be gender-specific and tailored. In particular, states should fully recognize the acute vulnerabilities and specific needs of trafficked women and girls during and post-COVID-19 pandemic. Likewise, states need to mitigate exacerbated vulnerabilities of children to trafficking resulting from the COVID-19 pandemic and the economic downturn, including potential decrease of access to child protection systems, public health care, educational opportunities, as well as the experience of domestic violence and additional discrimination and stigmatization of marginalized populations. It is very important to provide adequate funding and support for anti-trafficking frontline NGOs to safeguard availability of all necessary services to victims of trafficking and survivors of trafficking, as well as research, prevention, and awareness raising and advocacy activities during and post-COVID-19 pandemic. To strengthen prevention efforts related to the COVID-19 pandemic, states should raise awareness of legislators, policymakers, anti-trafficking stakeholders, and civil society on current and emerging challenges due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And finally, states need to address the demand for trafficking, for labor exploitation through effective implementation of national labor legislation and adopting measures such as ensuring safe and effective pathways for legal labor migration, strengthening and resourcing labor inspectorates, implementing penalties for unethical recruitment and labor exploitation, ensuring transparency in supply chains. These are just a few of the recommendations that were drafted based on the empirical data collected. And for the rest, you could find them together with our report on the OSCE ODIHR website or UN Women website. Before I conclude, I would like to focus on the voices of survivors again. Their voices must be included to ensure that appropriate efforts are made to combat trafficking in human beings with a human rights-based, gender-sensitive, and victim and survivor-centered approach. To strengthen this approach, ODIHR launched a call for applications for its International Survivors of Trafficking Advisory Council and will be launching the International Survivors of Trafficking Advisory Council next month. With joint efforts, we need to ensure that these emerging trends and challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic are comprehensively addressed and that victims and survivors of trafficking are guaranteed the best possible protection and reintegration. OSCE ODIHR stands ready to support participating states in fulfilling their commitments in their human dimension to combating trafficking in human beings. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Tatiana. Jerome, could I turn to you next?
Absolutely. Yeah, I want to thank you. Thank you again for having me here, and thank you, Tatiana, for being on the front lines of the whole COVID crisis. I mean, these are just amazing proposals that you've gathered together here that are just so decisive in terms of what the problem is. I mean, unfortunately, COVID-19 has forced us to rewrite the rule book on how we deal with human trafficking. We've seen human traffickers adapt in the most appropriate ways to COVID-19. Now, basically, what we've seen exacerbated the worst, as Tatiana pointed out, is the psychological effects. I mean, as a survivor, one of the things that you're definitely afraid of is that isolation, that lack of connection, that feeling of being alone. And COVID-19 has really pushed people into that darkness where they feel alone and very challenged, and those who would normally have contact with a therapist or with someone they're working with in rehab have been shoved back from that encounter, and now are being incredibly challenged. We've just seen a huge increase in survivors contacting us, asking for help, because unfortunately, as Tatiana mentioned, we've seen huge cuts just because of money allocated to deal with COVID-19 in the budgets of organizations that would normally help survivors. They no longer have that funding to be able to do that. So we're trying to do whatever we can to try and provide them the services they need so they won't slip back into a destructive pattern in their lives. Now, again, as Tatiana knows, I mean, it's challenging at best prior to COVID to deal with human trafficking and deal with survivors and victims. But this is really just, putting a wrinkle in that whole process. So we're very thankful for her involvement in dealing with this. But, I want to say, and again, one of the really amazing things about ODIHR and about Tatiana and what they're doing is, including survivors. Now, at a baseline, irregardless of everything else, having survivor involvement is putting that beacon of hope out there for other survivors and victims to see. Now, one of the things I've been so incredibly just honored and blessed to be able to do is to go out and speak about, being a male survivor. And a lot of individuals, are so afraid to talk about their experiences. They feel like it's better just to keep quiet, to go on with their lives. Many of them self-medicate with drugs or alcohol or following other destructive patterns. But having survivors involved in this process really does open up that window for somebody to come and talk about it and give them that hope they so desperately need to get involved in this process and be active. And again, having survivors involved also in creating legislation, creating protocols is so key, because I know that, in my experience in working with Homeland Security and with TSA and others, I can't tell you how wonderful it's been to kind of get them focused on the important issues. I mean, I think there are a lot of stereotypes out there, a lot of misgivings in terms of how they perceive victims of human trafficking. So I've been very happy to kind of, bring into strong relief what a victim looks like. When I was trafficked as a child, I was trafficked in school, and by all appearances, I was living a normal life, but I wasn't. So we've got to just bring that, bring that whole issue to light, that anybody can be a victim of human trafficking, and that we've got to work together and create these laws, create these protocols, and work towards prevention. Demand is one of the areas Tatiana mentioned, which has been sorely overlooked for so long. And we're very emphatic about addressing demand and pushing for, harsher penalties for those who actually buy and sell victims of human trafficking. Currently, we're not as aggressive as we should be. And in some jurisdictions, like in the one I currently am at, if someone is actually arrested for engaging in sex with an adult victim of human trafficking, they get a $50 ticket and they go back on their way again. So again, bringing that issue of demand to light and kind of circumventing that whole process. And one of the issues that we deal with is, talking to our young people and giving our young people information on what a healthy relationship looks like, and not letting them get, distracted, or not getting them get pulled into the whole, pattern of pornography and getting involved in getting these misperceptions about how relationships go. So we're very much into addressing demand and creating protocols. But as Tatiana so eloquently mentioned, we've got to get that funding in place and get these protocols in place and really get the involvement to make sure we can circumvent this. Because one of the things that, I know Tatiana is with me on this, I really feel like, my mission as a survivor is to help people like Tatiana and others, understand what vulnerabilities traffickers are going after. Because if we can isolate those vulnerabilities and help address them before the trafficker gets to that individual, we can just eradicate this whole problem. So again, going in, giving children a chance and adults a chance in education, better jobs, better programs, and then really just shrinking that ground beneath the feet of the traffickers so that they can go and exploit these individuals. So there's so much we can do, and Tatiana just beautifully outlined it in terms of the protocols that she's actually putting in place. But we're incredibly challenged right now. But again, as I say, the greatest weapon that we have is hope. And again, we're united as a global community in addressing this problem. I'm so thankful for that. So I really feel optimistic that we can really create a change and really, overcome, what this pandemic has done to all the organizations, all the systems we have in place, and really adapt and make sure that every victim and survivor is protected, taken care of, and has a right to a healthy and happy life.
Thank you so much, Jerome, and thank you again to both of you for giving up your time to be here today and for sharing those thoughtful insights into your work.